Welcome back to the Pursuit Podcast. I'm your host, Jessica Rose. Throughout May, we're looking at different aspects of funding. And today, we're going to be taking a look at some of the legal aspects of getting your startup, your company, or your project funded. As always, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Neximo. Neximo provides APIs for voice, SMS, authentication, and some other really fantastic developer tools. Neximo, thanks again for sponsoring the Pursuit Podcast. I'm here today with
Anthony Rose, founder and CEO at SeedLegals.
Anthony. Today we're going to be talking about the legal aspects of taking money on board for funding. What kind of legal aspects are there? What should people be thinking about?
So if you're a startup, you've got an idea, maybe you're a doctor with this amazing fitness tracker, or you a cyclist with this thing that's going to track your bicycle if it's stolen in London. And you know you need to build a product, you need to put together a team, and you need to get funding. And you've read the books on agile development, on minimum viable product. You've identified your market, and there's just one gap, which is you need funding to get started. So you know you need to find investors. But after that, there's this dark mass of stuff you need to do on the legals. And if you think about the way legals have been done in the contract world is, let's say I want to do something, an arrangement with you. I tell my lawyer what I would like. My lawyer swings the terms insanely in my favor, writes up about 100 pages of documentation for a funding round, sends it to your lawyer. Your lawyer's got their own house style, and they change all the founders from a lowercase f to capital F, shareholders to a lowercase s, because that's their house style. They change all the deal terms insanely to your favor. And then I look at it back again and try and read 100 pages of legals to find out what you really meant. And it's an insane way of working. Through this abstraction layer, not only is it turned into legalese, when really we want to agree very simple deal terms between us, and then encode it. But the means of communication is a red-lined Word document sent by email. So, were it to be a funding round in the UK is a fairly straightforward affair. HMRC, the tax office, have a fantastic set of investor incentives. Early stage investors get SEIS or EIS tax benefits. That's the Seed Enterprise Investment Scheme. And that means an investor investing in an early stage startup will get a 50% tax deduction on their investment for the first £150,000 of startup raises. And then for the next £10 million, they'll get a 30% tax deduction if the startup qualifies, which is most early stage startups.
So this is a good time to mention that you specialize in the legal aspects of taking on funding, mostly focused on the UK. Is that correct?
That's correct. Our market is the UK for now. We will expand later. But in the UK, we've revolutionized the way startup funding rounds happen, and we've optimized what we've done for the way funding rounds work, particularly in the UK. But I think as a more generic thing, if you've bought a house or an apartment, you'll have been surprised that perhaps it seemed like you're the first person in the entire world to have ever bought a house or apartment. It's ridiculous. Millions of people have done this before. Why isn't it standardized? There are a few key deal terms. What's the price? Or in the case of a funding round, what's the valuation? How much you're looking to raise? What are the investor protections? What are the warranties? There is probably about 10 standard things that people want to consent about. And then there are a range of lesser frequently debated things, but they're very important. And if you can bring those out and help founders understand and help investors understand, and within minutes agree what they are, then we've built a platform that builds all the legals for that. So what we've done is revolutionize things in a couple of ways. Firstly, by bringing out the underlying deal terms people can negotiate very efficiently. I want X, you want Y. We agree in plain English. Secondly, the computer then automatically builds all the legals with sort of machine-generated documents. It's not artificial intelligence, really. It's human intelligence. We've coded our deal experience over hundreds of deals to make the documents reflect what the market is looking for. And thirdly, the means of collaboration isn't an email with a red line changed Word document that everyone has to try and decipher. In fact, it's an online collaboration platform where you'll get a browser notification saying Anthony's updated the docs, and you look at the docs, you can e-sign, I'll get notified you've signed. And then the computer also builds automatically all the admin stuff, the cap table, the share register, the share certificates, and so on. So what we've done is essentially we've looked at a process. We've created a beautiful workflow where you can do each of the items step by step, and we then build those steps. And I think when we started SeedLegals, I perceived the problem was all about the legals. It turns out the legals are a very small part of the entire equation. It's all about the process flow, the social engineering, and I think explaining to people what steps are needed. And if you think about it, if you would like to invest in my company, I'm the founder, I would love to take your investment, and I know absolutely no idea how to do that, except there's something called a term sheet and a shareholders agreement, but I've no idea who needs to do what. And then you get to a site and it says, great, hello, you need to do these 12 steps. Let's start and do step 1, and then we'll do step 2. And there's no meter ticking like a law firm. You can spend as much time as you like, and our goal is to educate you. So I think that is the key change, that you're showing people all the steps and you're changing the way that people connect with each other. And in fact, when people want help, if it's a law firm, you're going to call the person, they can arrange a call next Wednesday at 12 p.m. But on our site, you just pop up the chat bubble and one of our team will be there with you immediately. And even a chat bot in some cases, although the chat bot, I'm not sure if it's a good or a bad idea, but sometimes it's helpful and sometimes it's like Alexa or Google, a bit strange. But that's the new way of working.
So you've touched on a lot of really valuable information really quickly, which is very exciting. So we're talking to a listener that maybe is just starting out on their startup journey or has participated in a funding round before, but not in their own project, not running their own thing. You talked about one of the big challenges being that there are a lot of legal terms out there that can be very dense and very challenging. Could we walk through a couple of them very fast to be like, hey, you, dear listener, if you're about to get started on this journey, you absolutely need to know these 3 keywords or these 5 keywords. What are the most important things you'd like to make sure people remember?
Okay, that's a great question. So I think the journey starts well before your funding round, which is all about getting investment ready. So if I've got a few minutes, I'll go through it. So the first thing is, let's say you and a couple of friends got together, you've got this idea for this new app, hypothetically. The first problem is, in a decent number of cases, things don't work out as you expect. One of the founders gets bored, gets hired by Facebook, the 2 founders don't get in sync, and things split up. So the very first thing you need to do is a founder agreement. And a founder agreement says all the intellectual property in the venture that has been, created before the venture started as a company or afterwards belongs to the company. And secondly, if I leave, my shares vest, which means if I leave in the first 3 years, I have to give back a proportion of my shares proportional to how long I've been with the company. And that's vital because if there are 2 founders who own, let's say, 50% of the shares each, they split up, the company may be uninvestable afterwards. No investor would put money into a company where 50% of the shares are sitting with a non-performing shareholder who's no longer with the company and in fact may even have a dispute with the company. So thing one...
That does sound like a challenging pitch. Like, hi, come invest in my company. You can have 3% of 50%, which is active. That doesn't sound like a great pitch.
Exactly. So that's founders split up. If they've got founder agreements in place, it can be an amicable split. If they don't, it's very difficult. And we've seen companies come to us who haven't done founder agreements and the remaining one has had to create a new company. And sometimes they can't continue with the idea at all because there's an intellectual property dispute. I own the idea. So thing one is, make sure that the founders have got agreements in place, which, by the way, you can do on SeedLegals completely for free in about 5 minutes.
Oh, very cool.
The second thing is, if it's in the UK, to apply to HMRC to get SEIS advance assurance. This tells your investors that you qualify for this tax scheme and assures the investors up front and basically makes you a lot more investable. That's a UK thing only. The next thing...
Yeah, for those of our listeners outside the UK, HMRC is the tax man.
That's the
tax men and women.
It's the UK version of the IRS, exactly. But for rest of world, the next thing is really to get investment ready. And investment ready means learning some of the terminology, and in particular, I think, learning how much to value your company and how much equity to give away. So here's my top tip. There are three things that are dependent variables, so to speak. There's the valuation of the company, there's the amount of equity that you're going to give away or sell in a funding round, and there's the amount of money you wish to raise. And the three of them are a function of each other. So you might say, I'm looking to raise £150,000 on a £850,000 pre-money valuation. Many founders think that the amount of equity they're going to give away is £150,000 divided by £850,000. But it's not.
Is this not the case?
But it's not.
Oh.
The amount of equity you give away is the amount of money you want to raise divided by the pre-money valuation plus the amount of money you want to give away. So your post-money valuation would be the £150,000 you want to raise plus the £850,000 valuation before you did your round. So it's £1 million afterwards, and you're raising £150,000 out of £1 million. So often founders will do the calculation incorrectly, which leads investors to believe they're going to get more equity than actually is the case. And there's an unhappy conversation to be had later when they get the shareholders' agreement or the term sheet. They were promised 3% of the company for their investment, and it turns out they've got 2.7%.
It'd be an embarrassing conversation as well. Like, hi, here's the papers. We're not scamming you. I'm just really bad at math.
We're going to change the world. We've got this fantastic AI product, but we can't work out the arithmetic on our valuation and equity dilution.
But trust us, sign here.
Trust us. We've got the rest of our calculations, and our business plan is just perfect. So my advice is always get on SeedLegals, and then it will calculate the numbers automatically for you. You say, I'm looking to raise this amount of money and this valuation. I think the next thing, which is super important, is to find out the valuation for your company. So, there you are, two people getting together to make this cool cycling app. How much is it worth? Is it worth £100,000 as valuation? Is it 10 million?
Well, it's my idea, so clearly it's the next $1 billion idea. I imagine that's thinking you run into a lot.
That definitely happens. I think, fortunately, that is in the minority, that people are generally, they know that the much vaunted unicorn, there are like 3 unicorns a year. It's statistically unlikely. But I think that people value their company in different ways. And one of them is they read a TechCrunch article and go, oh, wow, it's like $10 million. The second way is there's some sites or some articles that encourage you to look at the market size and run a spreadsheet showing, social media is $100 billion a year and we'll have just 1% of that in 3 years. So we'll be $1 billion in revenue. Well, the answer is you won't. So, you're just not going to eat Facebook's market share, or it's very unlikely.
That is a very polite way to address it as well. Like, well, probably no, honey.
Probably not, exactly. So I think one of the big dangers is where companies overvalue themselves at an early round. And the overvaluing has got two problems. One of them is it makes it much harder to raise investment because investors think you're dreaming when you come along with, two people with their mobile app. They haven't yet launched and they're talking about a couple of million valuation. It's just not realistic. Ideas are cheap, implementation is expensive. So first thing is many investors will just walk away if your valuation is unrealistic. But probably the biggest problem is the way funding rounds work is your goal is to give away a small amount of equity to raise enough investment to get you to the next step. And we find using data on SeedLegals, there are more than 3,000 companies on the platform, and over hundreds of funding rounds, we see that people give away a median amount of 15% equity in a funding round, which is super important. If your investors are asking for 30% of the company, you now have some data to say, that is excessive. By my second round, the founders will be in the minority. The investors will own the company. So your goal is 15, maybe 20% maximum to give away in a funding round, ideally. And that means picking a modest amount of money that you need to get to the next step where you can get the next higher valuation. So you find that your fundraising goes in a number of steps. Your first step might be a couple of £100,000 at a valuation of maybe £600,000 or £700,000. And then the next time round, you might raise £500,000 at a valuation of £2 or £3 million. And then you get into Series A territory and beyond. So at each step...
So these numbers are going to feel really familiar to our listeners. We talked to Katarina 2 weeks ago, who's the CEO of Personably, talking about her funding journey and really mirrored a lot of these numbers to say, well, you know what, when you first get that first burst of money, aim for about 18 months of runway. And then, talked about numbers in the UK that sounded really similar to what you're talking about.
I'm delighted, and Personally is a very nice success story. So it's good to hear that that journey worked for them as well. Getting back to the valuation challenge, the problem is that in order to get to the next step really involves showing growth and traction. So if you think about the journey of you as the founder, your first goal is, you have to have an idea, of course, but having had an idea, you need to find some colleagues to work with you to develop the idea. And then your goal is to build a prototype, build something to launch, acquire users, get more users, get revenue, and at each step, the valuation increases. The problem is that people are usually a little optimistic in terms of how fast things will grow. They think they're going to launch, and within a month, they're going to have 200,000 users. And the problem is it's very, very rarely the case. It's by a long way the exception that Snapchat or whatever it might be launches and got millions of users. The most part is you launch, you get very limited traction, and you have to work for months afterwards to establish what's called product market fit, to make the product actually what people want, not what you thought that they wanted, to make the login work and make it super slick, get marketing on board. And the problem is, during this period, you may be needing more money. If you've overvalued the company, you won't be able to raise more money at that valuation. So let's say typically in the UK, if you've launched and you've got limited traction, so you've built the product, it's out there, which is great, you might be looking at £1 million or so valuation. Obviously, it varies by market sector and many other things, but that would be a rule of thumb. If you valued your company at £3 million for your early stage funding round, in a sense, when you get to this point, you've proved that it's not worth £3 million. And if you then can only raise money at £1 million, you now have a down round. And a down round is a downer all round. Your investors who've invested at the £3 million get heavily diluted, they become very unhappy, and life is less good. So my suggestion is I like to spread the love a little bit. Your early investors come in at a slightly lower valuation. They will benefit on the next round and hopefully partake on the next round and be delightful investors who will spread the word to your new investors how fabulous you are. And I'm happy to give away a bit more of my equity for people who are going to take the risk to come on board earlier. Of course, that's just me. Others will look to give away a tiny amount of equity at a huge valuation. But, I guess I look at it as a marathon, not a sprint. You're all in it for the long term. The average exit happens after 7 or longer years. You're going to have multiple rounds. It's very unlikely you'll flip the company in 12 months. And so you and your investors are going to be together through good times and bad. And I think starting on the right journey with them happy, perhaps owning a share that they see increase in value at each round rather than go down, is desirable. So what's fascinating about this conversation actually is it turned out to be very little about the legals and a lot about the commercials. And that's exactly it. I think people perceive it's all about the legals. And it turns out it's actually not about the legals. It's about the commercial deal terms and understanding the mechanics of funding rounds and the way of working with investors. But historically, because that conversation has been encoded in hundreds of pages of legalese, it's all got lost in the noise. And so when we started SeedLegals, my perception is founders would be talking to us all about the complexities of the legals. It turns out almost none of that happens. Social engineering has changed everything. And what we found is that if you send me a Word document with 100 pages of legals in it, my natural inclination is to turn on track changes or my lawyer and fiddle with the document. I'm going to change the wording to my house style. If, however, I send you a PDF and I send you a website where you can view all the key deal terms. You can say, Anthony's got 3-year share vesting, you get this amount of warranties, you have a board seat. In plain English, your natural inclination is, in fact, to negotiate on the key deal terms or go, actually, that's exactly what I'd like. Actually, can I have 4-year vesting, not 3-year? So what we found is, in fact, hardly any of the discussion is about the legals. It's all about the deal terms, which is exactly what it should be, which was actually quite a surprise. Perhaps in the future, what we'll see is a change from today where the difficulty is about creating all those legal documents, but the machine just takes care of that. Maybe it's like in the olden days, you wanted a carpet. It was all about people weaving the carpet for months till you got your carpet. Now you decide it's all about what color carpet you want, and magically a machine builds the carpet that is exactly what you want, and 24 hours later your carpet arrives. You don't need to get involved in the making of it. It will get made reliably to your specification, and it's all about choosing the specifications.
So a lot of what you've been talking about sounds very much like the legal concerns, the legal aspects are just here to facilitate the potentially messy, always challenging human interactions around these deals.
I think that is precisely it. I mean, what is a legal document? A legal document, at least for the purpose of a contract, is it specifies in detail the way the deal terms, and it also specifies what to do if things go wrong. And I think for me, the mark of a good document is if things don't work out or a new situation arises you hadn't thought about, you can turn to a document which specifies what to do. So your co-founder leaves. What happens? Well, you look at your articles of association and it will say precisely, if they're well drafted, what happens if a co-founder leaves, for example, and their share vesting, or you look in your employee contract. So our goal, I think, when I have taken a step back and looked at it, is almost like a car manufacturer. My goal is to build a car that will keep you safe. If you're driving drunk, you fall asleep at the wheel, you're changing station on the radio, not looking where you're going, and bad things happen. So I can spend a huge amount of effort creating that car with all the safety protections that you didn't even think about. So when you're doing your funding round, my deal documents will include provisions that you may not have considered. So, for example, normally the founders are prohibited by the investors from selling their shares. In the UK, there's another fabulous government tax incentive, which may exist in other countries as well, where if the founders sell their shares, they pay only 10% capital gains tax, something called entrepreneur relief. So the challenge is the shareholders normally prevent the founders selling their shares. We create provisions that with the investor consent, founders can sell up to some fraction of their shares at any time, which is an amazing way of getting hundreds of thousands of pounds of value from the company at just 10% tax. So It's the sort of thing that no lawyer is going to tell you because it's just not relevant to them. No investor is going to tell you, you just wouldn't know. But that's one of the nice things that as founders and entrepreneurs ourselves, and I've used this provision myself, we now build that in for the benefit of everyone. So I think because we've moved from lawyers doing individual deals where the goal is just to do something sufficiently good for that deal and then do the whole palaver all over again, by building the machine. Think about, the Tesla factory or something, trying to engineer the best possible car that's going to take care of, all the needs that you did or didn't know that you had. Once you've moved into the factory model, where you're building the machine, it's actually a really interesting, completely different space because you can put insane amounts of effort because you only ever have to build it once and then it's automated afterwards, as opposed to the lawyer every time would have to be a labor of love on one deal that most people probably never read the documents in full. So the fact that the machine effectively changes everything.
So you've talked a little bit about these contracts and these legal processes being a fantastic way to eliminate those surprises, eliminate those potential scares of the unexpected. And you touched on potentially a founder leaving a couple times is a really fantastic example of this. What kinds of potentially scary things could come up that you'd really recommend a contract or a legal process being able to support for your startup?
Clearly, the funding round documents are the biggest ones for a startup. But I think we've really covered that. Obviously, you'll need a term sheet and a shareholders agreement and articles that govern the interaction between you and your shareholders and investors. But quite separate, there's the intellectual property part. And there, I think there are trademarks and patents. So trademarks are quite inexpensive in the UK. You can go to the government trademark office. It will cost you the grand total of £170. You can do it yourself. It's quite easy. You may be a gifted amateur at it. It may not be the preferred way of doing it, but if you're on a budget, you can do this on a Sunday night online, and you'll make some guesses as to the market segments you're in. But a trademark is something you should definitely do. In the US, the trademark website is a nightmare. The trademark categories were mostly about types of horse stables and tractors. I mean, they were mostly built in the late 1800s or something. It's ridiculous. So for the US, I need a trademark lawyer because it's just impossible to navigate otherwise. But where I'm going with this is trademarking your company name, I think, is a very wise thing to do. It's fairly inexpensive, and if you have a trademark dispute, it causes enormous trouble. You just can't trade under that name, and you have to rebrand.
And you just bought all these hoodies and socks. Like, yeah, you'd have to redo all your swag, your website. Yeah,
yes,
just a mission.
The swag is the lesser point. The bigger problem, of course, is your app store things change, all your marketing changes, all the work you've done developing your name, and then all the thought about finding a new name. And now by this time you're traumatized that the new name will have another trademark dispute. And the problem is there's so many self-similar names that it's very tough. So I always now try to, having thought of a name, find a suitable domain name and then try to trademark it. And sometimes it's easy and sometimes it's difficult, but it's recommended.
So that's a really interesting step into a lot of people's workflow. I have an idea. Oh, wow, I found a domain name. So you think everybody's third stop should be trademark that?
Absolutely. And so I'm a huge fan of user testing. So everything I do, we try to ask users before we build it. It's a, now standard type of startup development, which is once upon a time you'd build it and they would come. You'd build a WeWork office or you'd build a factory or a restaurant and people would come fairly predictably. But that's changed. You don't build something now until you've established that people want it, because it's very expensive, particularly to market it. So the idea is now you prototype it and see if people truly want it. But I like to apply the same methodology to everything. So when it came to SeedLegals, generally at about midnight or 1 a.m., I would have this brilliant idea for a name, and then I would buy the domain name, for a few pounds, and then in the morning I would ask my colleagues, and they would tell me it's a terrible name. So I thought I should.
I'm laughing at you. I'm laughing with you. I've been through a very, very similar process.
Right. So I thought, well, I should put my money where my mouth is, and I will do user testing. So we're at a workspace, which is, UK version of a WeWork. And so what I did is I went to the local cafe in the building and said, anyone who comes in with my business card, which actually I didn't have business cards at the time, so it was just a piece of paper saying, Anthony, and the working name of the company. If they give you one of these, there's a free coffee, put it on my tab. And then I went to all the companies in the, sitting in the foyer, in the hot desk spaces, who were really my customers, and I printed out a list of 12 names, and I asked them, if you're a startup and you're looking to do a funding round, which company might you go to based on these names? And I'd come up with these amazingly clever names, DocMotion and LexMarta and Clause.com and so on. And there was
Clause.com.
Yeah, exactly. And there was SeedLegals as one of them. and actually people went through them and they went, scary. Ooh, sounds complicated. Ooh, don't know what that one is. And when they got to SeedLegals, they went, oh, I know what you guys do. So SeedLegals was hands down declared the winner. Okay. And obviously based on that as the target market. If I'm looking to do, corporate enterprise, they might go, Seed's a bit early stage. But what I very much liked is I user tested the name I bought a bunch of domain names beforehand because, if you can buy them at £8 each, a year later, I didn't bother renewing them. But I sort of got a user-driven winner. And then I went off and trademarked it afterwards. And I think the UK trademark proceeded quite quickly. The US one ended up costing probably about $2,000 to get done. So I waited till I had funding for that. But trademark is important, which is in contrast to patents. So companies will often say, I need to patent something. If you've watched Dragon's Den or Shark Tank or something, the investors are always often asking, have you patented it? And the founders go, yes, I've got a worldwide patent, which is bullshit because it costs about... Firstly, there's no such thing as a worldwide patent.
No.
Secondly, it takes about 5 years to get a patent and it costs about $20,000 per territory, essentially, or region. So unless they've invested tens or more thousands of dollars or pounds in patents and have started filing them 5 years ago, there's no way. I mean, what's more likely to be the case is they filed patents in a couple of territories and they're just applications and they'll all get rejected or abandoned. So I think patents are a complete waste of time and money. And do not spend your time or money unless you're in pharmaceuticals or something that is a specific area. And I'm saying this from a position of knowledge because I've got 13 patents already and have spent huge amounts of my and my company's monies on those patents. But what happens is, firstly, only about a third of them ever get granted. Then those ones get slimmed down to a subset of what you had in mind. And finally, by the time they're granted 5 years later, business has moved on. You go, yes, we've got a patent for something that we no longer really care about or use. So other than very specific things, do not spend your time or money on patents. If your investors ask about it, explain to them that the startup and software world works about 10 times as fast as the patent world, and it'll take 5 years and $20,000 plus to get a patent. With the 1/3 chance you'll get it, it would be much more effective to just not spend your valuable company time and developers' time writing up the patents and money on this, and instead just get to market sooner.
That's fantastic advice. To recap, we should go ahead and point out that this is just advice. This is not intended to supplant or replace legal advice. Checking out a platform like SeedLegals or talking to your own lawyer in a local area might be the best fit for getting really good tailored advice for your startup. Anthony, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was wonderful. It was great talking. Thank you.
And thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to keep up with what we're doing at the Pursuit Podcast, you can find us on Twitter @PursuitPod. We'll see you next Tuesday with a brand new episode.